fatotum della città largo. La 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 la. Presto bottega che l'almeggia presto. La 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 la.
All right, welcome back, and today we are going to be talking about one of the most influential forms of theater to come out of the Italian Renaissance. We are going to be talking about opera. Now, most of you are probably already familiar with the term opera. Even if you've never been to one or ever heard one, you probably know what an opera is, and that in and of itself speaks to the longevity of opera and its importance. Opera is probably the only form of theatrical production which has remained largely unchanged since its inception. You look back at some of the stuff we've talked about, morality plays, cycle plays, the blood sports of the Romans, even the theater of the Greeks, all of it has had major transformations over the centuries. Opera has had changes, it's evolved as it's gone on, but the overall presentation is still largely the same as it was when it was first created. Especially when you compare it to the other form of popular entertainment from the Italian Renaissance, which we will talk about in a future video. Its core concepts are still around, but the actual performance style has morphed so much that it's virtually unrecognizable from its starting point. Opera is that great unchanged element, and that speaks to its quality and its importance. So, as we know it, opera gets its start around, I believe, the end of the 16th century, when a group of Italian intellectuals, this includes poets, composers, they wanted to find a way basically to reboot the presentation of Greek drama. They were looking for a way to bring these old stories forward into, again, what was at the time a modern setting. And what they decided on, for one reason or another, was to focus on the musical component. That those old Greek shows, remember, still had music as one of their core elements, the singing of the chorus and whatnot. And what they ended up creating was a form of theater that was totally reliant on music. That, of course, is probably the most distinguishing characteristic of opera, it being that it is entirely sung. Mood, emotion, character development, all of that is conveyed via the singing and the orchestra. There is next to no spoken dialogue in an opera. So that is probably the most recognizable component of an opera. But let's take a look at a few other interesting facts about operas and the way they are presented. So one of the really interesting things about opera as an art form is that it tends to take the hierarchy of dramatic elements as described by Aristotle and completely flips it upside down. As you recall, Aristotle said that music and spectacle were integral parts of the makeup of a play, but that they were the least important of those six elements. They were at the bottom. Well, opera takes it the entire other direction, with music clearly being the most important element, and spectacle close behind. Operas have been very big on the spectacle aspects since their creation. Large, impressive sets, big costumes. These shows were dependent on very big emotions. You're out there, you're singing very loud. You can't be doing that and singing about tiny little subtle emotions. These are big, big feelings, big, big themes. So naturally, all of the performance elements around it would have to be enlarged to fit that level of emotion. So operas are not big on subtlety. So spectacle is a huge part of their performance. Opera singers were and are some of the most highly trained singers in the world. People study their entire lives to become an opera singer. The skill involved in hitting some of these notes and the complexity of some of these songs is staggering. One of the great common jokes about opera is that all operas are tragedies, that there is no such thing as an opera with a happy ending. And this was no doubt due to the fact that many of the first operas were based on Greek dramas and myths. And as we know, the Greeks' favorite form of drama was the tragedy, and a lot of their myths didn't end too well either. So, because of this, opera kind of gets this stigma that all of its performances are tragedies. And while a great deal of them are in modern day, the genres have been expanded that it covers a wide range of topics. There are many hilarious operas. There are also ones based on fairy tales. There are some based on Bible stories or religious events, and some are even based on Shakespeare plays or historic events. But the tragedy has always been the opera's bread and butter. Operas were originally written in one of what we would call the Romantic languages, things like Italian, Spanish, Latin, German, French, things of that nature. Today, just about every language has an opera written in it. There are many, many English operas, and there are several in Russian as well. I can say I've seen several English operas. They don't have the grandeur in my mind. I'm sure that my friends who are opera singers will debate me on that. But to me, there is just something much grander about someone singing in Italian or German than there is someone singing in English, at least in opera. That's just my personal opinion. But a lot of the heavy hitters, the big name operas, those are all written in your Romantic languages, your Italian, German, and French, and so on. Just a couple of real quick vocabulary terms that you would come across when you are examining an opera. First of all, the libretto. This is the written text of the opera. In a musical, we would call that the book, that being the spoken dialogue. But as of there is no spoken dialogue in an opera, the script is written out in what they call the libretto. An aria. This is a solo song accompanied by the orchestra. This is the opera equivalent to a monologue or a soliloquy in a Shakespearean performance, usually the most heartfelt moment of the opera and the character's big defining moment on stage. Of course, if you've listened to any kind of music, you're familiar with the idea of duets, trios, and quartets. Of course, songs sung by 2, 3, 4 people, respectively. One last thing on opera before we go. You know, one thing that always interests me is finding out where certain slang or certain sayings that have crept their way into our vernacular, where did they come from? What are the origins of these sayings and things that we just throw around on a daily basis but never really consider? For example, if you've ever heard anybody say the whole 9 yards, you give it the whole 9 yards, we're going to go the whole 9 yards. What that refers to is the length of a chain of bullets in an old machine gun. If you ever see World War II movies where they're loading this big chain of bullets into the gun and firing and it's feeding through, the length of one of those is 9 yards. So if you go through the whole thing, you've gone through the whole 9 yards. So bringing it back to our conversation on opera, if you have ever heard the term, it's not over until the fat lady sings, this is a reference to an opera by a man named Wagner, featuring a character named Brunhilde, who was always played by a very big woman. Supposedly, it had to be played by a big woman because the amount of belting that had to be done over an orchestra. And keep in mind, this is back in the days before personal mics. So at the end of the opera, Brunhilde comes out and sings the last song. Hence, it's not over until the fat lady sings.